Hi, I'm doing an acrylic painting using fast flow paint and pouring medium. I'm painting Mona Vale Beach in Australia. When I went to the beach, I took lots of photos and paid attention to the colours I saw over different times over a couple of days. The sand had a wonderful warm orange glow to it at sunset, and there were bits of purple and magenta to the rocks I decided I wanted to emphasize. When I returned home, I had a look at the different photos and decided which ones I wanted to use, printed them out, and here you can see I'm sketching out using those photos, basically emphasizing the cliff face, which is the most noticeable part of the beach. Here I'm using magenta and yellow to create a base color, which I'll work over. When I'm doing the pour, I take 3 or 4 colors, place them on my plate, not a traditional palette, as they're too liquid and they'll just run off. And I do small sections at a time so that the very liquid paint doesn't get away from me. Now I'm using magenta to put in some shadows on the rocks and also to paint some of the rocks of the foreground. For the cliff face I used quite a few colours actually. I used phthalo green, magenta, light green, eggnog and yellow. The formations that the flow paint formed were actually quite good, but I found that the paint was a little dark, so once it's dry I'll go over it with some lighter colours again and just see if I can accentuate the features of the cliff a little bit more. The rocks I just finished painting in magenta. I've used a large brush. They're actually going to be in the foreground as from your viewpoint the painting is actually upside down at the moment. At this stage I'm not actually doing a pour. I'm just painting on the base colour for the rocks. I wanted a nice bright purple to come through once I put a pour over the top of it. For the sand, I was extremely naughty. I added a bit of glitter to the paint, a gold glitter, but mostly it was a small amount of magenta, lots of yellow, and lots of pouring medium so that the glaze would show a little bit of the canvas through to create a sort of watercolour effect. Still using a big brush as well. As you can see, I also keep spraying the canvas to keep it wet, so I get a nice bleed effect. The paint is very wishy-washy. Well, the cliff had dried, so I'm putting a little more detail in here, adding a few lights and darks just to add to the shapes that are there already. At this stage it feels like I'm using a lot of the magenta. I'm adding some more shadows in to the rocks, as well as adding some extra rocks in that I hadn't put in the first sketch. Sometimes when I'm doing a sketch, I will keep it to the minimum and then add the rocks later if I feel there's not quite enough there, and take a little bit of liberty as long as it still looks like the same beach. It's a little like painting a portrait of a place. Sometimes you can take a bit of artistic license. To do the lights here, I mixed up a colour using a little bit of magenta, a lot of yellow, a bit of white, and then once I'd mixed that up and poured it into the plate, I added a bit of eggnog to it for the texture. Of course, that's eggnog, the colour, not actual eggnog. So this is how I actually do some of the pours. I actually pour it straight off the plate, just using the lip to direct where I go with the colour, and then letting it sort of settle on the canvas. Here I'm grabbing a palette knife because the paint isn't spreading quite as much as I'd like it to. I don't want to wet the canvas, so I'll just use the knife to ease the paint on, being very careful not to mix it too much because I lose some of the texture if it does mix. At the moment I'm keeping the palette quite simple, magenta, yellow and eggnog, and now mixing the midtones to go on the rocks whilst the light areas are still wet. So I'm using basically the same colours for the midtones, just in different proportions. A lot more magenta and yellow, less eggnog, and then I also add a touch of the colours that I used for the cliff face. A bit of phthalo green mixed with magenta, just a tiny bit. There's something very satisfying when the colours start to interact when you pour them on and actually mix on the surface. But you do have to be very careful you don't put on too much because they can run and then you lose all control. Because you're using gravity as part of the process, you have to be very aware of the surface that you're pouring onto, making sure that it's at the angle you want, or if you're not wanting too much movement, as flat as you can get it. Okay, for the last bit of the rocks, the shadows that go at the base, again, same colours, just a little more of the dark cliff face colours, which are phthalo green and magenta mixed together. It's very dark, almost black, and then to that I add the magenta and yellow and eggnog. It's a very messy way of painting, so you have to be careful that if you drip some on your painting, especially if it's in a place you don't want it, you are quick to spray it with some water and clean it up. The paint dries very quickly. Here I'm doing the rocks on the other side of the painting, quickly mixing up some lights. There's already some dark paint, wet dark paint there already, and basically I'll just go over the top of it and give a bit of shape to the rocks. For the next part I'm going to be putting in the sea and the sky and finishing the painting off, so look out for part 2. So here's a close-up of the rocks so you can see how the paint looks as it sort of interacts. And that's it for part 1 of the Mona Vale painting. Thank you for watching.